Lunar Lander was an arcade game released by Atari in 1979. The original game was a vector-based arcade game, which are some of my favorite games that exist, period. Games like the Star Wars arcade, Tempest, Asteroids were some of the coolest games ever because of the vector graphics on the screen that made the image glow. There's nothing like vector-based games these days, and I feel like it's a lost art. Today I'm talking about the brand new Lunar Lander Beyond, which is a new take on the original. This one has its own drawn art style, so it's quite different in visual design and vibe. Lunar Lander Beyond is a reimagination based loosely on the original with a full narrative, characters, and so forth. You know me, I'm not big on story, but what's good about all the cutscenes is that they're totally skippable, so thankfully you don't actually need to watch them if you don't want to. The only time you might want to is if you get to a mission with an objective you can't figure out on your own, but everything's pretty self-explanatory. It should be noted that this is not part of the Atari Recharge series. Those try and stay somewhat more true to the original games. This is sort of its own thing. If you're looking to play the original game, it's available on Nintendo Switch as part of their new Atari 50 collection. This version works well, and it was instantly playable. I was trying to play it on my Mister, and I couldn't get the thruster controls to work for some reason. It probably does work, but I'd have to mess around with it for a while, and I was having trouble. But I like that the Switch version just works instantly without me having to tinker with button mapping and all that forever. With the original game, you're just trying to land on landing pads, and you have to be going at a very slow speed not to have your ship blow up. It was notable at the time for changing the player's perspective by zooming in as the module nears the surface. Slowing down requires a lot of fuel, which you can add by putting in more quarters into the machine. This must have been a real quarter muncher back then. The arcades I was in growing up usually never had this machine, but I did play a lot of Asteroids back in the 80s. Apparently, the first 300 Asteroids cabinets were released with Lunar Lander side art. So basically, Asteroids replaced Lunar Lander, like Star Trek The Next Generation replacing TOS. And maybe that's why it was easier for me to find Asteroids machines growing up. It was also on Game Boy Advance back in 2005 called Millipede Super Breakout Lunar Lander. What a great name. I tried it out and I didn't like that port at all. Stick with the Switch version if playing the original at home. Though, of course, finding a real machine would be awesome because it had that big thruster level on the control panel, which is cool. Anyway, let's talk about this new Lunar Lander Beyond game. You're basically doing the same thing as in the original arcade game, but here there's a lot more objectives. You collect gems, rescue people, and try to make it to checkpoints. There's 30 missions to go through in the campaign. The first several missions are very easy, and they're basically just trying to get you accustomed to the controls. At first glance, this game might remind you of Solar Jetman on NES, but the controls here are a lot more forgiving than that game. One major new mechanic is that your pilots get stressed the more missions they go on, and the more damage that happens to your ship. I've said before on many of my shooter streams, imagine being the guy inside the ship. It must be absolutely terrifying and very stressful. By the way, did you know that the pilot inside the Vic Viper ship had a name? Yeah, it was James Burton. I bet he got very stressed fighting all those enemies in Gradius. Elvis Presley's guitar player in the 1970s was named James Burton too, so I like to think that he's the one flying the ship. What do you think was more stressful, flying the Vic Viper or dealing with Elvis on a bad day? So they actually incorporated the idea of stress on the pilots in this game. On top of repairing ship damage, you have to take care of the pilots themselves. If they get too stressed on missions, they start having hallucinations, which is kind of funny. So to combat this, you take anxiety medication, which is very 2024. It's pretty funny to me that the pills you take are just floating around in space. Are there like giant pharmaceutical ships just flying around dropping off huge pills that are as big as your ship? How does the pilot swallow these giant pills? Do the pills shrink like Link's weapons? Or is this dude just an expert at swallowing? I wonder how he got so good at that. There's different pilots to choose from, so in between missions, you can leave one at the space hospital to recuperate while you take out another pilot on a mission. The more you play, the more experience they each get, depending on how well you do on an assignment. The first mission that got even remotely difficult was this one where you have to protect a dome over a city while it's being pelted with meteors. What makes it hard is you have to collect these shield items that give you limited invincibility to destroy the comets. You have to keep the comets at bay long enough until the timer runs out, and then you'll win. But this one requires some actual skill, and I feel like this is where the game really gets started. I have a feeling this is where most normie players will get filtered if they try this. The good news is, when you beat this mission, you get a new power-up, the ability to use shields, which you can use to protect yourself from cannons and landmines. There's many different ship abilities you can bind to the buttons on your controller, and they made that very easy to do, which is good. As you progress, you unlock a bunch of different abilities. There's a booster to go fast, but I find that the brake jets that make you come to a dead stop is key to making it through any of this. Another thing to keep in mind is conserving your gas by letting your ship move by momentum. One thing I like about this a lot is that there's a radar, and these stages can be pretty big, so it's nice to have an arrow on the radar to give you an idea where to go next. As you get further into the game, you unlock other ships. The Dragonfly moves differently than the first ship. There's no thruster, so you just use the control stick and it's a lot more maneuverable. It's really good, but when you're using this, it doesn't really feel like you're playing a lunar lander game anymore, because the original was all about that thruster control. But to be honest, it controls so much better, it's a nice change of pace. The bad thing about the Dragonfly is that it's pretty weak, and if you bump into anything, your stress levels get high pretty quickly. So I find myself redoing missions a bunch so that I don't have to send the pilots to rehabilitation all the time. There's some things I think could be done to improve this game. Even though you can skip the cutscenes, there are a lot of them that pop up. I would include a no cutscene mode where they just never come up at all. All you really need is a list of objectives that's easily accessible. I do like the idea of including stress levels for pilots into the game. I think that's unique. But the way this is done, you have to keep sending the pilots into the rehabilitation, which means you can't use them for a couple rounds. Then you have to pick a different pilot who's a lower level, which in turn gets you to replay previous missions to level up your additional pilots, and I feel like there probably is a better way to go about this. I got the Spider ship too, which controls a lot more like the first ship. It has thrusters again, like the old lunar lander, but this ship is really hard to control. The advantage is that it moves super fast, but the maneuverability is pretty rough. Something I think this game really needs is some kind of an endless mode with an online leaderboard. The missions get kind of samey after a while, so being able to compete with real people in an online mode, I think would give this more reason to keep coming back to it. Also, once I got the Dragonfly, it made me never want to use the thruster ship again because it maneuvers so much easier. I was recently playing Turbo Overkill, and in that, the starting pistol they give you is useful for the entire game. You actually want to keep using that starter gun forever. I think it would be nice if there was more of a reason to use that first ship, even when the other later ones get unlocked. On another note, the Atari 50 game is really cool. It has a bunch of old arcade games, and it also has a lot of history about the company. There's 2600 games, 7800 Atari Jaguar, and even Atari Lynx. It's not every single game, but there's a pretty good selection. It's great that there was a collection like this made in an easily accessible way to the public since it's on the Nintendo Switch. I do have to say, I love that they included a segment called "Did They Do Drugs at Atari?" Guess what the answer is? It's yes.